Hey guys, today we are going to talk about the event that was the closest we ever got to nuclear war, and this is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in October of 1962. Actually, there's a really good movie with Kevin Costner about this called 13 Days that I show a lot of years. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to do that this year. That if you're into this, that you could check that out. It's pretty good. All right, so how did we get to this point? All right, so during the Korean War, the US and the USSR kind of waged an indirect war. But during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it will be the United States and the Soviet Union staring eye to eye at each other. So, a little background how this took place. In 1959, Cuban rebels are going to overthrow the dictator Fulgencio Batista. It was a guy that had kind of been put in place by us. And he will be replaced by Fidel Castro. And Castro will install communism in Cuba, and he's going to rule for almost like 50 years. His brother Raul rules for him now. Okay, and he he has all kinds of history of elimination of political freedom. A lot of Cuban refugees down in Miami and stuff like Castro is like a cuss word to them. Okay, and it's a big deal though because Cuba is only like 90 miles away from the coast of Florida. So, in response to Castro coming into power, he took over control over the U.S. owned sugar factories and made everything government owned, right? Communism, socialists, like we talked about. So, how does the United States respond to that? We put an embargo on all trade to Cuba. Cuba is not allowed to trade anything with the United States. That's why like Cuban cigars are like this um, like taboo thing because they're supposed to be illegal. Uh, the embargo was lifted briefly under the Obama regime, but then reinstilled under the Trump regime. And so, when the United States cuts off um, trade with them, Cuba then turns to our enemy, the Soviet Union, for economic and military aid. And Khrushchev, who's the guy that's in control, Nikita Khrushchev, who takes over after Stalin dies, will gladly uh, welcome this alliance with a island so close to the United States coast. And so the tensions between the United States and the USSR get even worse when in 1960 the Soviets shoot down one of our reconnaissance planes, what we call a U-2. All right, we were spying on the Russians, and our pilot Francis Gary Powers, okay, who's actually the guy that broke the sound barrier, uh, safely parachutes, but he ends up, getting captured by the Soviets, and it's really embarrassing. We had to negotiate for his release, and this was just weeks before we were supposed to have a peace talks with the Soviets, and so this peace summit ends up being put on hold, and the deterioration in relations between the United States and the Soviet Union increases once again. So, what we're going to end up seeing is that the United States doesn't like the idea that we have a communist government supported by the USSR just 90 miles south of our coast. And so the CIA says, hey, man, we could train Cuban refugees, guys that had, exiled, and we can train them and then let them try to overthrow Castro. And the Joint Chiefs, who are like the leaders of the military, are like, yeah, we can do this. This will be easy. And so the Kennedy regime okays this. Unfortunately, it ends up being a big disaster and a huge humiliation. Okay, so this attempt to overthrow Castro was called the Bay of Pigs invasion because of the location where they had landed at. So you can see kind of how we did this here. And so those 1,500 Cubans tried to lead an uprising against Castro, but it's quickly crushed. And as I said, the president at the time was President John F. Kennedy, and this blows up in his face. Really big humiliation for him, and kind of comes into play a little bit in how the way that the chief of staff, or the Joint Chiefs, I'm sorry, the Joint Chiefs in the military kind of view Kennedy as well, and how he views them. All right. So both the United States and Soviet Union, as we talked about, the arms race began for nuclear war, and Khrushchev secretly built 42 missile sites in Cuba. We had missile sites in Italy and Turkey. And so in October 1962, a U-2 spy plane flies over Cuba and sees the installation things of what's going on. This will start the 13 days that'll be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis is the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles. Make sure you say that they are nuclear missiles in Cuba. And the idea here that's so scary is that these missiles could destroy Washington D.C. within like 5 minutes time. That's how quickly these things would happen. And the Soviets said they did it because we had missiles in Turkey as well as in Italy. So this is like a fear that we both could destroy each other in just a matter of minutes. And so when this happens and this is discovered, the Joint Chiefs tell Kennedy, we need to go in there and we need to do an invasion of Cuba. You know, we hit them with airstrikes first, blow up all their military bases, and then do a full-on invasion of Cuba. Which the problem with that is, what are the Soviets going to do, right? The Soviets then are going to come after us, right? So Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, suggests a different approach. Instead, let's delay this for we can have backdoor communications by setting up a blockade. We stop other Soviet ships from coming in. The problem is a blockade is officially an act of war. So instead of calling it a blockade, we call it a quarantine. And so like ships that are carrying food and stuff are allowed to pass through, but all ships are subject to be inspected, which no Russian ship is going to allow an American to board it. So like this is like a major tension as the Russian ships get closer and closer to this quarantine line. Okay? And so, but neither side are willing to budge, right? And so, as I already talked about, under the rules of engagement, you can board for an inspection. Uh, but as they're coming, the U.S. discovers that there are actually submarines that are coming along with them. We actually throw a depth charge to get them to come up. And if you watch the video, there's like how close that could have caused war. I mean, this was extremely tense. All right. And the idea is that both sides don't want to back down. And the idea that you're willing to risk nuclear war to get an outcome that you think is advantageous, there's a term for that called brinkmanship. You're going to the brink of war. Okay. And so what ends up happening is right before actually a few ships actually cross the quarantine line, but very shortly after, they turn around. And so that was averted. All right, first chance there of possible nuclear war averted. And U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously whispers the phrase, "We were eyeball to eyeball, but the other fellow just blinked." All right, we were eyeball to eyeball, and the other fellow just blinked. So here's Khrushchev, and this is Kennedy here, sitting on their nuclear missiles, arm wrestling. Who's going to be the one? But see how he's about to push the button? This is like the red button. Like there was a red button that if you pushed, the nuclear missiles would launch, right? That was the whole thing. Okay. And so while the Joint Chiefs go to DEFCON 2, which is the farthest we've ever come to nuclear war, there are 5 steps, starting with DEFCON 5, working your way up. We got all the way to DEFCON 2, which is readiness for nuclear war. Before we go to this, though, right? And Kenny gets real mad about that. Actually, if you're watching the movie 13 Days, because this is like signaling to the Russians that we are escalating war, and he's trying to calm things down. And so what ends up happening at the United Nations, we come up with all the proof that the Soviets are doing this and make them look like the bad guys. And it was like a really big event if you watch the movie. But through backdoor negotiations, like we have Robert Kennedy, who is John F. Kennedy's brother. He negotiates with a guy that's Khrushchev's old military buddy, like because neither side can do face to face, or they'll look weak. And so these backdoor negotiations come about, and it is because of those negotiations that we come up to an agreement. The agreement that ends the Cuban Missile Crisis is the Soviets will remove their nuclear missiles from Cuba, and the United States has to promise to never invade Cuba or try and overthrow Castro, which we've honored. And then secretly, we said 6 months later that we would remove our missiles from Turkey and Italy. They were obsolete anyway. But that had to be done secretly, and if there was any connection, we would deny it, right? Because we couldn't make it look like we were like selling out our allies for our own self. So what I want you to put for an answer, as the official answer, is that they removed their missiles from Cuba, and we promised to never invade Cuba again. All right, I do encourage you to watch that video. It's 5 minutes, cartoony again, and I think he does a really good job. All right, thanks, guys. If you got questions, send me an email.